You are listening to Extended Techniques, a podcast about contemporary music through the lenses of timbral innovations.
Visit extendedtechniques.com for all the program details, live music reviews, and our recommendations for contemporary music events in New York City.
Follow our Facebook page, subscribe to us on iTunes, and enjoy the sounds.
Your hosts are Erlena Dlu
and Alotro Lado. In our podcast, we talk about unconventional or non-traditional ways of playing musical instruments or singing to obtain unusual sounds.
But sometimes we will take the idea of extended techniques in music further, to extended compositional techniques, and up to extending the definition of music itself.
And we will start this departure today, as the topic of our program is A Liberator of Sound, John Cage's contribution to extension of timbre and compositional technique.
The whole world is virtually silent about his centennial these days.
Yes, everyone is listening to unintentional sounds, as if replicating 433 in everyday life. So, why do we talk about him?
Cage introduced new aesthetics of music that is based on close attention and contemplation of the quality of sound.
He extended the idea of musical instruments, basically using any object to make music, and also using electronics and tapes to transform it.
Not only, he developed new compositional techniques, chance operations, and indeterminancy.
Which are completely different things, by the way. Keep listening, and we'll tell you more about this.
His ideas encouraged both performers and listeners to do what Cage believed to be the wisest thing, to open one's ears immediately and hear a sound suddenly before one's thinking has a chance to turn it into something logical, abstract, or symbolical.
Is music just sounds? What is more musical, a track passing by a factory or a track passing by a music school?
Before studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains. While studying Zen, things become confused. After studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains.
Cage was influenced by the ideas of Indian philosophy and Zen Buddhism, being in the moment, not being concerned with goals and exact outcome, complete presence in the process.
In Western society, people are concerned with exact outcomes and reaching goals, but care less about the present moment. Engagement with Zen Buddhism led Cage to perceive music differently.
Dr. Suzuki was asked, "What is the difference between before and after?" He said, "No difference. Only the feet are a little bit off the ground."
Zen philosophy is reflected in the way he defines experimental music, an act, the outcome of which is unknown. And the same idea goes to the concept of his indeterminate works. He argues that a performance of a composition that is indeterminate of its performance is necessarily unique. It cannot be repeated. Nothing is therefore accomplished by such a performance, since it cannot be grasped as an object in time.
If you are looking for a completely indeterminate piece, listen to this.
So, if each performance is unique and cannot be grasped in time, it makes little sense for us to play a lot of recorded music in this program. We only want to give you a feel of how some of his works sound like.
Did you know that Cage's writings were published before any of his music got published? In his Foreword to Silence, his first and most important collection of lectures and writings about music, he said,
"My intention has been often to say what I want to say in the way that would exemplify it, that would conceivably permit the listener to experience what I had to say rather than just hear it."
The stories at the end are very good.
In this program, we will attempt to talk about the music of John Cage and his ideas in a way that would exemplify them.
But they'll probably say, you're naive.
Like in experimental music, the outcome is not foreseen.
I do hope you can explode that idea.
Do you mean to say it's a purposeless play?
You are listening to the first program of Extended Techniques podcast, a liberator of sound, John Cage's contribution to extension of timbre and compositional technique.
Cage started writing percussion music during his 2-year study with Schoenberg. Instead of paying for lectures, he promised to dedicate his life to music.
Is it true that after Schoenberg said that Cage had no feeling for harmony, he decided to use noises?
Yes, so that harmony would be out of question. At least that's what he said. And he liked to mention quite often that Schoenberg never had time to attend his percussion concerts.
During a counterpoint class at UCLA, Schoenberg sent everybody to the blackboard. We were to solve a particular problem he had given and to turn around when finished so that he could check on the correctness of the solution.
In his Future of Music manifesto, delivered as a talk in Seattle in 1937, Cage stated, "Percussion music is a contemporary transition from keyboard-influenced music to the all-sound music of the future. Any sound is acceptable to the composer of percussion music. He explores the academically forbidden non-musical field of sound insofar as is manually possible."
Cage wrote a lot of percussion works in the late 1930s and 1940s, and even formed the John Cage Percussion Quintet.
I'm holding a photograph of this group, published in the Time magazine on July 29, 1940, featuring Lou Harrison, John Cage, Doris Dennison, Margaret Jansen, and Xenia Cage, his wife, with the slogan, "Let there be music from pots and pans."
And you can see this photo on our website, extendedtechniques.com.
When Xenia and I came to New York from Chicago, we arrived in the bus station with about 25 cents.
John Cage was married to Xenia Andreevna Kashavarov, a daughter of Russian Orthodox priest, for about 10 years.
I went back to Xenia and told her what had happened. She said, "Call him back. We have everything to gain and nothing to lose." I did.
When in 1940 he was asked how long they had been wed, Cage replied, 5 years, but I didn't begin practicing percussion on her until after we married."
People aren't sounds, are they?
Why not? At least anvils and water gong are. At the time when Cage was touring in the West Coast with a percussion ensemble he and Lou Harrison had founded, he wrote 3 percussion pieces with the word construction in the title. The first, construction in metal, for percussion sextet with assistant, was written in 1939 and involved not only anvils and water gong, but also Japanese and Balinese gongs, Chinese and Turkish cymbals, and automobile brake drums.
Let's hear how they sound, performed by Amadinda, percussion group from Hungary in 1998.
The first construction in metal is the first composition where Cage used fixed rhythmic structures. He will use this technique for another 17 years.
And how did he get to use these instruments and techniques?
Both the use of ethnic percussion and the rhythmic proportions technique was inspired in part by lectures with Henry Cowell. Cage attended them in New York City in 1933.
But you said that there were 3 constructions. What are the others?
The second construction was composed in 1940, where not only percussion instruments but also prepared piano is used. The score instructs to place a cardboard and a screw in the strings. And third construction was composed in 1941 and dedicated to Xenia Koshivarov-Cage. Some of the instruments are rattles, drums, tin cans, cowbells, lion's roar, cricket caller, and conch shell.
Indeed intriguing. Let's hear how it sounds performed by the same Amadinda percussion group. It's interesting that such exploration of sound started from a remark of Oskar Fischinger, an abstract filmmaker, who claimed that sound made from wood had a different spirit than one made from glass.
After a conversation with Fischinger, Cage ran immediately to compose percussion music, a quartet for 4 percussion players. He recalls the following in his Composer's Confessions of 1948. I had no idea what it would sound like, not even what instruments would be used to play it. However, I persuaded 3 other people to practice the music with me, and we used whatever was at hand. Tapped tables, books, chairs, and so forth. When we tired of these sounds, we invaded the kitchen and used pots and pans. Several visits to junkyard yielded more instruments, brake drums from automobiles, steel rings, hardwood blocks.
But percussion music was not an original idea even then, right? It already existed in Oriental cultures, and Cage had access to this music through Henry Cowell.
Sure, but for him, percussion music wasn't a derivation from any exotic music. It had roots in Italian futurist ideas, and Luigi Russo's manifesto The Art of Noise of 1912. For him, percussion did not mean just sounds obtained by striking, but all sounds, inclusive of noise.
A sort of liberation of the dissonance.
I'd say liberation of all sounds from the limitations of musical prejudice. He said, no matter what kind of sound it is, it can become musical by taking its place in a piece of music.
So Cage explored these ideas together with Lou Harrison as they traveled presenting their work in Mills College in Oakland, San Francisco, and finally New York.
Yes, they became good friends, and Cage recalls in his Confessions, just as the weather never tires of repeating the seasons, so Lou and I never tire of discussing again and again problems involved in musical composition.
The explorations of percussion later led Cage to his involvement with prepared piano.
And prepared piano affair was closely connected with dance. It started when a dancer Sylvia Ford commissioned Bacchanali, a dance which she choreographed, and which for Cage was evocative of her African heritage. There was no room for percussion instruments on stage, so he only had to use the piano. He finally found that muting the piano with metal, rubber, wood, and plastic could result into a type of percussion orchestra.
But the muting of instruments already wasn't new those days. Hot jazz musicians in New Orleans were altering the sound of the piano by placing sheets of paper between the strings, and also Henry Cowell used fists and arms to play the keyboard, and palms of his hands to mute the strings.
You will hear a little more about Cowell and Cage, but mostly about the results of their impact on contemporary experimental pianists in our next program, Prepared Piano Today.
By the way, you can see all the details about our programming, music reviews, and New York events calendar on extendedtechniques.com. Except for resembling percussion orchestra, what did the discovery of the prepared piano mean for Cage?
He was fascinated by the microtones that resulted from muting, the very small pitch differences that are excluded from standard classical repertoire, and also by the unlimited possibilities of sound that a single instrument could provide.
Let's hear the sounds in Amoris for prepared piano and 3 percussion players. It was composed in 1943 and is one of the first pieces that John Cage wrote in New York.
The first and last movements are for prepared piano, second and third for percussion. It was the first piece with prepared piano that Cage wrote initially, independent of dance.
But later it was still performed with a dance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City by John and Xenia Cage and Merce Cunningham. Let's hear a modern performance by Amadinda Percussion Group.
In his Confessions, Cage said that amours concerned the quietness between lovers, while his later work, The Perilous Night, another piece for prepared piano composed in 1944, concerned the loneliness and terror that comes to one when love becomes unhappy.
The piece is one of his most personal and expressive statements. It was written in a period when Cage was very confused and sad, resulting from his imminent separation from Xenia. After the premiere at the Studio Theater in New York, a critic remarked that the last moment sounded like a woodpecker in a church belfry. This upset Cage because he thought that he poured a great deal of emotion which he didn't in fact communicate.
Another problem with The Perilous Night was that it sounded differently on different pianos, and also that sometimes pianists could not prepare it in the right way. 25 years later, he reflected, "When I first placed objects between piano strings, it was with the desire to possess the sounds, to be able to repeat them. But instead of possibility of repetition, we are faced in life with the unique qualities and characteristics of each occasion. And so my work since the early 50s had been increasingly indeterminate."
Piece became one of the turning points in his philosophical discoveries about music.
Music. What does it communicate?
Right. Another important conclusion was that music is not made to communicate anything, since he couldn't communicate his emotions.
This seemed to be a very big issue, judging from his autobiography of 1989. He said, "I determined to give up composition unless I could find a better reason for doing it than communication. I found this answer from Gira Sarahai, an Indian singer and tabla player. The purpose of music is to sober and quiet the mind, thus making it susceptible to divine influences. I also found the writings of Ananda K. Kumaraswamy that the responsibility of the artist is to imitate nature in her manner of operation. I became less disturbed and went back to work."
Let's hear some of this revelatory piece performed in 1988 by Margaret Langton. Margaret Land 10 also premiered a 1989 piece for bowed piano called One. In this case, the performer had to work out the technique for incorporating bowed tones. In August 1993, she recalled her conversation with John Cage.
I think he was taken with the idea of bowing piano strings because an element of controlled non-control is inherent in the process. Discipline is required to control the bow, yet the resultant overtones are deliciously unpredictable. This expectance of the unexpected concurred with his philosophy.
Yes, Cage asked Tan not to take it seriously and play whatever comes to hand when she gets to each piano without knowing what she was going to do until getting there. One is played on up to 4 pianos and also involves some choreography. In addition to using the keyboard, the performer has to move in and out of each piano's interior and traverse the distances between them. Margaret recalled her feelings about the performance.
As I arrived at each piano, I would find not that I was going to play, but rather that I or it was playing. At the instant of sound, I would be simultaneously performer and audience. Evaluating the results would be irrelevant. Simply let sounds be sounds, in John's words. It helps to remind myself that in keeping with Zen tradition, he liked to see himself as a poser of questions rather than a provider of answers.
If you don't know, why do you ask?
We will now play for you a fragment of One for prepared pianos performed by Stephen Drury.
You are listening to Extended Techniques podcast, John Cage, a Liberator of Sound. In an interview for New York Times in summer 1992, a month before his death, he said, "I think it is true that sounds are, of their nature, harmonious, and I would extend that to noise. There is no noise, only sound. I haven't heard any sounds that I consider something I don't want to hear again, with the exception of sounds that frighten us or make us aware of pain. I don't like meaningful sound. If sound is meaningless, I'm all for it."
On the way from the East Coast to New York in 1943, Cage stopped in Chicago, where he was commissioned by CBS to write accompaniment for a play called The City Wears a Slouch Hat. And he wanted to use the actual sound effects developed in radio stations as sounds, that is, as musical instruments.
So he wrote 250 pages of score for instruments, timbre, loudness, and relative pitch, which he imagined, but which might not have existed. But it turned out to be impossible to perform, and he had to write a new score for percussion and amplification of small sounds. The audience in Chicago was enthusiastic, but not the East Coast audience.
Because in New York there were, and still are, too many things going on. By the way, our recommendations for contemporary music events in New York City are available on the calendar section of extendedtechniques.com.
Wherever we are, what we hear is mostly noise. When we ignore it, it disturbs us. When we listen to it, we find it fascinating. The sound of a truck at 50 miles per hour, static between the stations, rain.
Is there such thing as silence?
Cage found that silence did not exist. In the late 40s, he went into the anechoic chamber at Harvard University, and in this room, made as silent as technologically possible, he heard two sounds, one high and one low. The high was the nervous system, and the low was blood in circulation.
So there is no silence.
Yes, he said there are demonstrably sounds to be heard and forever given ears to hear.
Then, the silent piece, 433, actually meant to show what we hear when we listen to so-called silence, meaning the sounds of environment.
Yes, people interpret it in so many ways, but very few listeners know what is in the score. 3 parts of silence of any length, to be performed by any number of players on any instrument.
It was the first performer of the piece, David Tudor, who decided on the length of the sections and chose the piano when he played it at Woodstock in August 1952.
One may ask, who is the composer in this case? But also, imagine August in Woodstock, rustling leaves, birds singing. Maybe Kay just wanted the audience to pay attention to the sounds of nature and hear them as music.
Cage indeed loved sounds of nature and treated them as music. Some of this affection came from his fascination with philosophical writings by Henry Thoreau, who wrote about nature as if it were art.
Not only nature, sounds of passing train, street noise. The older Cage became, the more he quoted Thoreau.
Music never stops. It is we who turn away.
Cage also said, for any one of us, contemporary music is, or could be, a way of living. But where do the sounds of nature and everyday life enter his compositions?
One of the most famous works that uses sounds of everyday life is Water Music, a theatrical piece where a performer is instructed to make sounds that involve water, pouring water from one cup to another, using whistle that produces sounds when filled with water.
This piece is best appreciated visually, so you can watch the performance by Cage himself at Gary Moore's show on our website.
Seriously, I consider music the production of sound, and since in the piece which you will hear I produce sound, I would call it music.
According to John Cage, any sound is fascinating, even more so when amplified. Take, for example, 0 minutes 0 seconds, composed in 1962, an electronic version of 4 minutes 33 seconds. The score of this piece instructs to perform a disciplined action in a situation with maximum amplification, which Cage himself did once during a happening when he put a throat microphone around his neck, turned up an amplifier, and drank a glass of water.
Cage also used amplified sounds of nature in his works for tape and electronics. For example, in his electronic piece Cartridge Music, written for the Merce Cunningham Dance Company in 1960. It uses phonograph cartridges and various objects, pipe cleaners, wires, feathers, matches. Contact microphones are attached to pieces of furniture, to which cartridges are also attached.
Cartridge music was one of the first theatrical pieces of live electronics. It was performed by David Tudor, Takehisa Kozugi, and Michael Pugliese. They collaborated a lot in the 1970s with projects involving electronics. Kozugi and Tudor designed their own circuitry for electronic sounds.
Let's hear some of Cartridge Music, the original live performance of 1975. I believe that the use of noise to make music will continue and increase until we reach a music produced through the aid of electronic instruments, which will make available for music purposes any and all sounds that can be heard.
This statement from the Future of Music Manifesto, first delivered by Cage as a talk in 1937, marked the beginning of his involvement with electric and amplified instruments, and later with electronics.
Earl Brown and I spent several months splicing magnetic tape together. We sat on opposite sides of the same table. Each of us had a pattern of the splicing to be done, the measurements to be made, etc.
You will hear more about early electronic music, including that of John Cage and David Tudor, in one of our future programs.
In spite of these obstacles, we went on doing what we were doing for about 5 more months, 12 hours a day, until the work was finished.
For now, let's listen to what he considers his most neglected masterpiece, Williams' Mix, for magnetic tape that took about a year of tape splicing.
By the way, Cage composed a lot of works for electronics by means of chance operations.
You are listening to a podcast about John Cage, which is indeterminate of its performance.
Not yet, or rather, even though it is indeterminate to a certain extent, at this time we are only talking about chance.
Revolution can never stop.
Cage used chance procedure in composition in order to liberate sounds from, as he said, relationships between them.
In 1952, he explained, "To more and more completely liberate sounds from abstract ideas about them, and more exactly to let them be physically uniquely themselves, knowing more and more not what I think sound is, but what it actually is, in all of its acoustical details, and then letting this sound exist, itself changing, in a changing sonorous environment."
Or simply put, in his works, he wanted to combine sounds using some set-up procedure rather than using his own taste to make the selections.
Right. In the late 1940s, he used Magic Square, where he put sounds instead of numbers, and made compositions that were in some way beyond his control, because he simply made moves on the charts to select sounds.
The magic square and then chance operations, going out through sense perceptions to follow a metal ball away from likes and dislikes.
He was at that time already involved with Oriental philosophy. Christian Wolff showed him I Ching, or Book of Changes, an ancient Chinese book of wisdom, a very complicated device.
The I Ching includes 64 hexagrams. Cage devised charts or tables with 8 times 8 equals 64 cells. In those cells, he would put either nothing, indicating musical silence, or some musical event. He included charts for number of events that happen simultaneously, tempi, durations, type of sounds, and dynamics. To determine which element from the chart would be chosen for successive events, he would throw the dice.
The idea to use chance operations in composition is based on the desire to eliminate personal taste, what Cage called remove the I from decision-making.
To discover new combinations of sounds that he would not imagine, so to speak, letting the nature do it.
Changing himself and his own notions of what is beautiful so that life becomes wider, to make progress in music faster.
When in 1977 Cage was asked how does this relate to beauty, he replied that each thinks certain things are beautiful and others aren't. But in order to perceive beautiful things, there is a need to have something that is not beautiful. And he quoted Wittgenstein that beautiful is something that clicks for you.
An added own idea. If it didn't click, I suggest that you reach in your pocket and take out a clicker.
He said, chance operations result into things that weren't on my mind, and I find that things that I didn't think would work.
A way to reach out to the world.
Discovery never stops.
When we do what we choose to do, we are taking the inner path. And this is the path that many people are taking, but Cage decided to go in a different direction.
The principle underlying all of the solutions acts in the question that is asked.
Disciplining yourself rather than relying on yourself.
A discipline by means of chance operation, a path to the rest of the world in a structured way.
And he used this path in many works since 1950 to the rest of his life.
Let's hear such disciplined sounds on the piano in the most famous chance piece, Music of Changes, composed in 1951 in association with David Tudor.
So we'll play for you 1956 performance by David Tudor, Book 1.
You are listening to a lecture on composition, which is indeterminate of its performance. Extended Techniques podcast is not an example.
There is some misconception about chance operations and indeterminancy. Some people think that they are the same things, while in fact they are in a way the opposite concepts.
Neither piece uses chance operations. The indeterminacy in the case of music walk is such that I cannot predict at all what will happen until it is performed. Chance operations are not necessary when the actions that are made are unknowing.
In indeterminate work, composer outlines the process which a performer has to carry out, or sets up certain rules to follow. But the final sounds that will come out are completely indeterminate. Many of such works don't even specify instrumentation.
In a work composed by means of chance procedure, all final sounds are determined. Only the order in which they will occur depends on the throwing of dice and their location on the chart.
The only similarity between these two compositional techniques is that no one, including the composer, knows how a particular performance of the piece will sound. The difference, however, is that in case of chance, there are many, for example 640, possible combinations of sounds located on the chart, while in case of indeterminate work, there is an infinite number of possibilities.
But in both cases, a composer does not do the entire job of composition. In chance operations, the final result depends on the luck of performer or conductor when they are throwing a dice, and on nature.
I should let you know that the conductor has no score but has only his own part, so that though he affects the other performers, he does not control them.
In case of indeterminate works, the choices are made entirely by a performer.
Right, a performer experiments with sounds by means of a process devised by a composer. Indeterminate composition, as Cage defined, is necessarily experimental.
An experimental action is one the outcome of which is not foreseen.
Being unforeseen, this action is not concerned with its excuse. Like land, like air, it needs none.
A performance of a composition which is indeterminate of its performance is necessarily unique, it cannot be repeated.
When performed for a second time, the outcome is other than it was.
Nothing is therefore accomplished by such performance, since the performance cannot be grasped as an object in time.
Finally, I said that the purpose of this purposeless music would be achieved if people learned to listen.
A recording of such work has no more value than a postcard.
I think I've heard this before.
Ah, yes. In a lecture delivered during Darmstadt summer courses in 1958, Cage mentioned Bach's The Art of the Fugue as a work that is partially indeterminate, because timbre and amplitude of the material are not given. Indeed, there are still disagreements with respect to instrumentation of the art of the fugue.
How do you feel about Bach?
So Bach was the first experimental composer?
Don't go too far.
But if the performers can interpret a work in any way they want...
No, they have to think of their choices seriously and usually practice a lot.
And there was only one rule. No silliness.
Cage often was dissatisfied with performances and had a very clear idea of an ideal sound for many of his compositions.
Ideal? The sound produced by David Tutor, you mean?
Not only him, but many musicians know that it is often more difficult to perform a work by John Cage well then to play a through composed work from the score. Margaret Lenton, one of the few musicians whose performances Cage approved, in 1993 explained, "Indeterminancy is not an invitation to anarchy. Only through knowing the material so well that it has become reflex does one become free to produce responsible indeterminate performance." As John said, the biggest problem was finding a way to let people be free without becoming foolish.
So that their freedom will make them noble. How will I do this?
Some works, however, were both indeterminate and used chance operations. Imaginary Landscape number 4 is an example. Chance operations are used to determine the loudness levels, durations, and stations tunings on 12 radios. The dial turning was precisely notated, but what was heard depended on what was being broadcast during the performance.
The first performance in 1951 was totally boring because it happened at night when very few stations were still broadcasting. However, I witnessed a performance by Mark Pekarsky in Moscow in December 2004 where the outcome was just perfect. The music and the words of the different radio stations seemed to speak to each other almost as if ending sentence of the previous one.
A good example of combination of both chance procedure and indeterminancy is Atlas Eclipticalis, composed in 1961, where exact instrumentation is not specified, from 1 to 86 instruments, and tempo is not given.
This reminds me of the details about music we know from 1,000 years ago.
Cage used the Atlas Eclipticalis 1950.0 and Atlas of the Stars, published in 1958 by Antonin Bechvar, a Czech astronomer,
Music of the Spheres.
superimposing musical staves over the star charts in this atlas. Brightness of the stars is being translated into the size of the notes in the composition.
The music is there before it is written. Composition is only making it clear that that is the case.
We have it for you on the saxophone.
And on the cello.
and full instrumental scoring performed by SEM Ensemble, conductor Peter Kotick, recorded in 1992.
The world would be an impassable heap of old rubbish were it not for mushrooms and their capacity to get rid of it.
My work is what I do and always involves writing materials, chairs and tables. Before I get to it, I do some exercises for my back and I water the plants, of which I have around 200.
Ramakrishna it was who said, all religions are the same, like a lake, which people who are thirsty come from different directions, calling
When
its
Sri
water by
Ramakrishna
different names.
was asked, why, if God is good, is there evil in the world? He replied, to thicken the plot.
I don't think we should try to define music, but if we say, for instance, that it is self-expression, that's a mistake.
Contemporary music
If it has to do
is
with
not
self,
the music of the
then
future,
it has to do with the
nor
alteration
music
of the
the
self,
past,
changing
but
of the
simply
self.
music
This
present
is what
with
Thoreau
us,
said.
this
It isn't
moment.
important
Now
what
Now
form a
that
sculpture
everything
gives a stone.
So easy.
It is important what sculpting the stone does to the sculptor.
There's so much to do.
A sound does
Music
not view
itself is
as
the
thought,
ideal
as
situation,
ought,
not the real
as
one.
needing another
A lady's
sound
voice
for
said,
its
is this
elucidation,
John Cage, the
as
percussion
etc.
composer?
It has no
I said
time
yes.
for any consideration.
To Cage.
It is
Are you willing to
occupied with
prostitute your
performance
art?
of its characteristics.
I said yes.
Before
You're
it
too
has
good
died
for us.
away,
We're going to
must
save
have
you
made
the
perfectly
Robinson
exact
Crusoe.
Music is the
its
means of rapid
frequency, its
transportation
loudness,
to
its
life.
length, its
Artists
overtone structure,
talk a lot
the precise morphology of
freedom.
these and of itself.
Contemporary music is not the music of the future, nor the music of the past, but simply music present with us. This moment, now, this moment.
Experience is
Am
different,
I a
and
butterfly?
each experience is changing. And while we are thinking,
Dreaming
I'm talking, and contemporary
that
music
I
is
am
changing. Like life,
a
it
man.
changes.
For any one of us, contemporary music is, or could be, a way of living.
The past does not influence me. I influence it.
By no means. Remain a musician.
That's all for today. Your hosts are Erlena Dlu
And Alotro Lado. Visit extendedtechniques.com for all the program details, live music reviews, and our recommendations for contemporary music events in New York City.
Follow our Facebook page, subscribe to us on iTunes, and thank you for listening. If nothing was accomplished by this program, then your ears are in excellent condition.